Thank you. And thank you all for being here. I have a little caveat at the beginning, but I think it's not that important for this small community that we have right now. First, that this presentation isn't really focused on TESOL. I think like a lot of the talks at CoTESOL this year, it's more peace and justice oriented. And so it's focused on education generally, higher education specifically, and the themes of peace building and pedagogy in conflict-affected context. But there are some themes coming out of what I'm going to present today that are relevant to TESOL. So I just published a separate paper on English medium instruction in conflict-affected context, and I posted that into the chat box, so you may be able to get it from the chat box. But if not, I'll share it with you later. So if you're interested more in the TESOL aspect of it, I can share that work with you afterwards. So as John introduced, my name's Kevin. I'm an assistant professor at Seoul National University. And today I'm going to share a paper that's titled Challenges and Opportunities for Peace or Conflict in Higher Education, Insights from Afghanistan and Somaliland. This is a paper that's coming out of my ongoing research in both of these contexts that is funded by the National Research Foundation of Korea. And of course, I thank them for their generous support of this project. As an overview today, I'm going to first describe the background and objective of the study. This will be followed by an overview of the methods and context, and then I'll look at the conceptual framework and the findings before concluding. One thing that's quite interesting, I think, here is that I'm using a fairly unique perspective in the conceptual framework, which I'm framing as the third phase of the three phases of education. Okay, so given the growing importance of higher education within the international community and its efforts to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, this study examines the challenges and opportunities for higher education to contribute to peace building in two conflict-affected and post-conflict settings. For more than a decade, the international community has explicitly stated that the achievement of global development goals is dependent on addressing access to quality education in conflict-affected context. In 2015, the SDGs extended this to higher education, yet in settings affected by conflict and post-conflict context, higher education is often perceived to be a luxury, not a necessity. Despite recent research indicating the positive role of higher education to contribute to post-conflict recovery and to the promotion of democracy, preservation of culture, and professionalization of the social sector. The driving research questions for this paper then include: what are the challenges and opportunities that faculty face teaching in conflict-affected context? How do university educators pay careful attention to local context in unique and particular ways? How does this affect their choice of pedagogy? Are the pedagogies across Afghanistan and Somaliland the same or relatively similar? And what are the implications for curriculum, teaching, and research more broadly? To address these questions, I designed a comparative case study with university educators in two universities in Afghanistan and Somaliland, which I'm going to refer to throughout this presentation as Case University A and Case University B. Data collection methods included semi-structured interviews, document analysis, and digital artifacts. I interviewed 12 faculty at the universities, and interviews were approximately 60 to 75 minutes each. Participants were chosen purposefully, first through key informants and then via snowball sampling. Following interviews, data was transcribed, member checked, and analyzed through an inductive thematic analysis and constant comparative method. To be clear, there are three other authors with me on this paper. So there's an effort toward intercoder reliability throughout this. The analysis was conducted in 3 rounds and led to 4 emergent themes, which I will discuss shortly. But before I just introduce the university context, before I discuss the themes, I'm gonna introduce the university context. Case University A in Kabul, Afghanistan was established in the mid-2000s after the US started its campaign against terrorism in 2001. It is a comprehensive university offering majors across different disciplines with about 1,700 students, of which, very importantly, approximately 1/3 are women. The university has experienced several terrorist attacks, and since the Taliban takeover of the government in August of 2021, the state and continuity of the university remains uncertain. To be sure, all of the interviews in this study were conducted prior to the Taliban takeover. Case University B in Somaliland was built in post-war Somalia after the fall of the Siad Barre regime in 1991. There are more than 7,000 students at the university, and its Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies has trained many leading public officials in the country. In both Somaliland and Afghanistan, organized violence remains a concern with ongoing threats from Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, and the Taliban. Thus, both universities offer a deep reflection on the potential for university teaching and learning in conflict-affected contexts to contribute to peace building or to perpetuating intolerance. Now I turn to the unique perspective of the three phases of education that I'm using in this study. To make sense of the data, I employ the conceptual framework of Bush and Saltarelli's two phases of education. Bush and Saltarelli write, education is often used as a panacea for a broad spectrum of social ills, from racism to misogyny. Yet, if it is true that education can have a socially constructive impact on intergroup relations, then it is equally evident that it can have a socially destructive impact. This perspective, education, as having both a positive and a negative face, has been widely employed throughout the literature. However, most of this writing is focused on education generally. I expand it here to higher education specifically. Yet I expect from my review of the literature and from my personal experiences teaching in the Global South and in conflict-affected context, that teaching for peace and coexistence in and through higher education is often much more complex and contingent than a duality of positive or negative allows. Thus, I turn to a third phase of education to make sense of the data. Metro explains education's third phase. Is neither the bad sort that perpetuates war nor the good sort that delivers social transformation, but the sort that may be more common in conflict and post-conflict situations, well-intentioned, if theoretically muddled, passively executed, somewhat problematic, and having mixed effects on society. From peace studies literature, this third phase suggests that it may be more common for education to promote negative peace rather than positive peace. That is, education may not necessarily be promoting sustainable peace, but it is de-emphasizing war. This is neither good nor bad. It is not the negative face of education that Bush and Saltarelli discuss, nor is it the positive face of emancipation. It is in between, a decent starting place to work towards reconciliation and peace without embracing cynicism or giving up demands for something better. The data in this project suggests precisely this, so let me now turn to the findings. There are 4 salient themes that emerge from the data. They include debates over strict pedagogical standards, the notion of the university as a sanctuary, contentions with liberal white saviorism and navigating tradition and modernity, and finally, challenges with teaching in English in conflict-affected context. Due to time constraints today, I'm only going to discuss the university as a sanctuary and the contentions with liberal white saviorism. Several faculty indicated they believe the students perceive Case University A as a sanctuary. P4 described it as a safe space for the students, especially for women. She suggested that in contrast to the outside society in Afghanistan, in which women's opportunities may be restrained, inside the university, female students are provided a free space. P2 called this a sanctuary. P2 and P4 observed that many female students at the university remove their traditional clothing, such as scarves and hijabs, and change into westernized clothing, such as jeans and shirts. They said the female students reported they feel free and comfortable and are never judged on campus by removing their veils. Moreover, they suggested that whereas it was frowned upon that a girl is being educated outside the university, inside the school, the girls could study in peace. It is notable here that free and comfortable are framed together with westernized and peace, in contrast to life outside the university. For these educators, these values are to be embraced and taught. Yet such values are not straightforward. They are contested amongst the faculty. For example, P6 cautioned that such liberal perspectives should be approached carefully. He explained, institutionally, we've got to tread such a fine line. I mean, we've got a huge mosque built on the ground. If at any point, I think if we were perceived to be sowing the doubt or to be encouraging people to be less Muslim, or even, even discussing things like atheism or things like that, I think we would be out of business real quick. He went on to describe his reserved approach to pedagogy, in which he avoids discussion of the Taliban, Islam, or other potentially contentious topics in the classroom. He stated, I mean, we do have some very, very conservative students. Maybe we could have some very open and honest and calm debate, but I somehow don't think so. His approach to teaching in conflict zones, then, is to circumvent topics that could be perceived as political or controversial. In other words, there are several contested topics that he would rather not address openly in order to maintain negative peace. This approach contrasts with P2 and P4, who identify the institution as a liberal sanctuary for the students and who raise discussion about values and differing perspectives in their classroom. This brings me next to the topic of liberal white saviors that emerged in the data. P1 suggested that many international faculty at the university, whom she termed liberal white saviors, spread a distorted vision of quality education as being that knowledge which is from the West, which includes values such as individual rights, liberal democracy, international law, and global organizations. She explained, this is grounded in a superiority complex related to unexamined colonial legacies that position the West as superior. She said, I'm struggling every day with the majority of our international faculty feeling that they're coming to Afghanistan to really spread their vision of quality knowledge, number one, but at the same time behave with national faculty as if they were superior. I mean, they would never say that, but I can see that in the interactions of the faculty. Related to this liberal white savior notion, several participants discussed the dilemma of balancing between what they perceived to be global and modern spaces within the universities and local and traditional spaces outside. For instance, P4 and P5 highlighted the challenges of negotiating between the constructs of what they called local and traditional versus global and modern. P5, for example, expressed a desire to promote women's individual rights, which she associated with her home society, but felt this is hampered by local customs. Yet at the same time, P5 indicated that she did not want to reinforce the American culture of indoctrination by telling students to disregard their local cultures and customs. Rather, she highlighted the importance of engaging sensitively with the local context in which students are situated, carefully navigating between the tradition-modernity binary and between local and global norms. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip through the rest of the findings and go to the discussion. As the data indicate, tensions with pedagogy, liberal white saviorism, tradition and modernity, and English medium instruction complicate efforts toward peace building through higher education in conflict settings. Faculty responded to these uncertainties and challenges in diverse ways. Some implemented and advocated for strict policies on learning, while others promoted more empathy for students studying under difficult circumstances. This tension was especially raised in relation to the English medium instruction in both universities. Yet it was also suggested in Afghanistan that the university offered a sanctuary where female students could escape, speak like native English speakers, a contested notion in the literature, and study in peace. Here I find that education is as Metro described, neither the bad sort that perpetuates war, nor the good sort that delivers social transformation, but well-intentioned if theoretically muddled, passively executed, somewhat problematic, and having mixed effects on society. These findings then hold implications for curriculum, teaching, and research. With regard to curriculum, curricular implications include the need to incorporate local indigenous knowledge into the learning. As indicated throughout the paper, participants from Somaliland argued for greater indigeneity in the content. P7 called for more indigenous knowledge in the curriculum, and P12 warned that the dominant use of the English language might perpetuate Western hegemony by failing to integrate local knowledges. Here, Zimby-Loss suggests that curricula can be localized and decolonized by including the histories and experiences of colonized people into the learning. And Metro calls for ensuring the inclusion of diverse teacher and student voices in the classroom. Next, with regard to teaching, it is crucial for educators to critically reflect on the often taken for granted assumptions that prevail across context. As Kester and Crimmon indicate, challenging widespread assumptions in peacebuilding and higher education in different settings requires unveiling how actors in the field find themselves complicit in furthering the very violences that they seek to mitigate. For example, several international faculty in Afghanistan critiqued the liberalism of the institution and its faculty as being out of place in its context. Specifically, they critiqued the liberal white saviorism in the university. Thus, as the participants show themselves, reflexivity can be a useful tool to support faculty in potentially disrupting unjust practices. Finally, as argued throughout the paper, a critical implication for research is the need to move theory and practice in conflict-affected contexts beyond the good-bad binary to engage with the under-theorized middle ground. This argument calls for examining what is going on between and beyond the two faces of education. Here, employing Metro's third phase of education might help better capture the complexity of higher education in conflict-affected context. As Metro explains, the third phase is the sort that may be more common in conflict and post-conflict situations. In the end, these findings demonstrate that higher education for peace is more muddled and complex than a simple manifestation of positive and/or negative faces allows. I conclude then that university educators working for peace and development in conflict-affected context should aim to further engage the in-between. Maximize the positive of higher education peace building, for example, promoting multi-perspectivity and critical debate. Minimize the negative, for example, intolerant curriculum and epistemic injustices, and embrace the more common middle ground. It is here that higher education peace building is perhaps most promising. Okay, thank you very much. And I will post into the chat box the links to those papers and talk.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin, for presenting your, your research. And we have 10 minutes or maybe more time. Are there any questions?
Well, that was stimulating as always, Kevin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jocelyn.
I'm really excited to hear about this middle ground, and I'm kind of curious whether like maybe I missed it because you packed in a lot of information at one time, but I'm wondering who might have talked about that middle ground specifically, because I'm more familiar with the positive negative piece of Galtung and not the middle ground. But I think that in language use, I might be able to connect some of this to peace linguistics work. And then the other thing that came up for me is really this idea of Jenkins' edu-learner. Well, actually it's Reardon's notion, but I've read about it a lot recently in Jenkins' work as well. So I think we need training when we go to new places, but we also need to be equipped as educators to be edu-learners. And I think that we're not always, especially people who don't have any educational background, they come into the university with their specialization, but maybe not with the ideas about how to teach it. So yeah, those were things that came up.
Yeah, Jocelyn, I think there's a lot there. So the third phase sort of concept, it came from Metro originally.
Okay.
And so she and some other scholars that have been writing in the field of education emergencies have suggested that we need to be cautious with this duality of positive and negative. That a lot of the work that we do in these contexts, we find that there are aspects through which the work that we're doing is very transformative. But there are also many aspects in which the work that we're doing is quite reproductive of global inequalities. And thus it's rather than being either or, it's probably a mix of both of these. And so we want to account for both how we're reproducing, but also transforming these social structures. And so I think in that sense, this third phase offers this much more realistic perspective of what's taking place in these contexts. So I didn't speak about it today, but in the paper, there's really interesting implications with EMI. Now, the reason, so in the other paper, both of these universities are English majority universities, let's say. Not English only, but the instruction is taught in English.
English medium.
And so with this sort of English medium instruction, there are some very interesting implications with this. One that, as Philipson and others, of course,
and good evening to everyone from everywhere around.
That's one of the videos. I clicked on the link and it opened up.
That's my wife.
Sometimes we lose the chats when the room closes. So.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Yeah, that's my wife. It's like, where's that voice coming from? So the interesting things with the EMI in that context are that, again, as Philipson says, it's linguistically imperialistic, et cetera. It's exclusive. It reproduces socioeconomic divides. And this came up in our data that the students who came from well-off backgrounds that could afford to run from the conflict in Afghanistan and to go to Pakistan. And they went to EMI schools in Pakistan, they learned in English. And then when they came back to Afghanistan to be at this university, that prepared them much better to be studying in that institution. So the socioeconomic division between the classes was reproduced through the choice of EMI in that institution. So that's sort of the dark side of it, if you will. The light side of it was that many of the now, we didn't interview students, we interviewed faculty. So the student voice is coming through the faculty. But the faculty indicated that there were some students who indicated that English was a safe space for them, the language itself. That they were able to talk to their friends in a coded language where they were not being surveyed. The adults around them or those that they might wish to escape from weren't able to follow their conversations. And so they felt that this was a very safe sort of language to express themselves in. Now, it's a very, complicated sort of modality of teaching, right? And I think here that we see through Metro's lens that this is neither good nor bad. It's really this sort of mix of positive and negative and everything thrown within it. So it really comes out in that EMI data, this idea of Metro's third phase. And Jocelyn, I'm sorry, I forgot what the second part of your question was.
Relating to edu learners and training.
Oh, yeah. With Jenkins, yeah. So with Jenkins and Reardon, exactly. So, this is related to that former point where now we're talking about the pedagogical strategies that we're using in the university and how we may be able to use pedagogical strategies like an EduLearner that can disrupt the inequalities in the learning space, right? So if we if as much as possible, create this horizontal learning situation in which, for example, maybe we engage multilingual teaching, and we allow students to express themselves in their local language, et cetera, and make language much more diverse within the classroom, then I think that's a really powerful instance of EduLearner taking place in the class that tries to circumvent around the exclusions that are there. And I see that Ryoko has a question or a comment.
Thank you so much. It's a very interesting study, and I learned a lot. Your comment about English as a safe space, that's interesting, right? It could be any language, doesn't have to be English, but because of the status of English and colonial connection of it, I think I guess it's positive and negative, because it could be very problematic because it really reinforces the image of English as a, language of liberalization and all these things. But anyway, Yeah, I really I still need to learn about this third phase. But it's interesting. It's also not positive, negative, but also it's contextual, right? It's really depending on the context and depending on the situation. You know, sometimes we could really take on these very controversial and challenging issues, but other times, even in a kind of potentially safe place, depending on the situation, we might not want to talk about it, right? So, so it just seems to me that it's not just about issues of peace, but it's about all controversial issues. And I actually wrote about that and I put it in the chat, but this was published in 2015. But I talked about something like, you know, historical conflict, and I didn't know how to deal with the situation that came from the students, you know, all of a sudden, very unexpectedly. And I did a lot of thinking about it. And it's a really continuous issues for me, and even like some human rights issues, including issues of gender, language, and so forth. Not language, gender, race. You know, like how do we approach anti-racism? Is it universal concept? You know, it's not actually, right? If you go to a different country, it's dealt with in different ways. And it's a constant exploration for me and learning. And I think we need to just continue learning. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that comment. And the contextualized aspects of the research, I think certainly, I didn't emphasize it, but certainly needs to be emphasized throughout the work, that as you say, what might look positive in one context may be entirely negative in another context. And so the contextualization, you know, even between Afghanistan and Somaliland, there was a completely different relation with EMI, for example, because Afghanistan, you know, was not, you know, it wasn't at any point English speaking context. Somaliland was colonized by the Brits, and it is largely an English speaking context, although English is not the dominant language. So the relationship to the language was quite different in both of those contexts. And there was a beautiful quote, it's in the other paper, but a beautiful quote from one of the participants in Somaliland that talked about her identity. And she said something to the nature of like, when I was in elementary school, we spoke in English, and so I was English. When we were in high school, we spoke in, I guess, Arabic. And so I was then Arabic. And then it wasn't until university that I was able to speak in English, or sorry, to speak in Somali. And then at that point, I felt like now I'm Somali. But throughout my life, I've been British, and then I was Arabic speaking. And then, you know, so really fascinating her relationship to the language of instruction in the schools and how she located herself. So, you know, and within the context, also the changing dynamics of that context, how, you know, it's not static, but it changes over decades. And then where do we fit within this at a different time in that place? But I just want to say thanks for the comments about the contextualization. Very, very helpful. And I'll look at the paper later that you shared with us.
Oh, sorry, everyone. Just letting you know about the schedule. And yeah, thanks so much, Ryuko and Jocelyn, for your comments and your questions. So it is 2:30. There are 2 other sessions happening now at 2:30. And I'm available. I think Kevin might be available to stay here a few more minutes if anyone would like to continue the discussion. And I had a quick question, Kevin. I think you mentioned it is notable that 1/3 of the student body are female at case A in Afghanistan. And so I was wondering, do you have data? How does that compare to other universities or other schools in Afghanistan? Or could you elaborate a little bit more about that data?
It's a good question, John. If you stick around for a little bit more, Ryoko, I have a question for you as well, if you have time. So in terms of the other universities in Afghanistan and the demographic of those schools and whether or not they're male or female, I'm actually, you know, how many of the women are within the institution, the demography is women. I'm not positive, John. I didn't look at that data, but I wouldn't be surprised if this particular institution was more female than the others, that it wasn't representative. And the reason for that, because this institution has a very strong tie to the West. And it is perceived both within Afghanistan and internationally to be a liberal Western institution as much as an Afghani institution. And so I can expect that because of that, if families wanted to send their girls to schools, to a university, that might have been the university that they selected. Now, there's something really important here in this, John, because after August of 2021, when the Taliban took over, the first thing they did was shut down the university. So it happened immediately. In fact, even before the Taliban got to Kabul, the staff of the university had already escaped.
Wow.
This is long stories. I don't want to get too much into this, but the university had been attacked by the Taliban multiple times. Because of those attacks, there was multiple fortifications around the university. There was a sniper tower in the center of the campus, and there was also an exit tunnel to get out of the school. So as the Taliban were coming into Kabul, the staff had already escaped. They burned all the servers because they want to protect the students of the university. And so anyway, the physical campus is still there, but the faculty and students are not on the physical campus right now because it's not safe. Those who were able to leave because they were international or because they had the resources are already gone. But a large number of those women that you're talking about are still there in the country, and they are still studying with the university online, presumably from what they consider to be a safe space.
Yeah.
You know,
it needs to be done in secret, maybe, or
it has to be done in secret. Yes, and they're taking a great risk to still be involved. But so about a third of the students are still involved via online. And I would expect many of those are the women.
Oh, that's so terrible to hear. And maybe just a quick follow-up. Do you think that would be the case? Just in general, maybe K-12 education as well. Are there fears, or are there realities of persecution against students?
I mean, I only know what I've read in the literature and what we've all seen in the news since. But yeah, persecution certainly seems to be taking place. And anyone that seems to be affiliated with in the past or still seemingly to be affiliated with Western regimes or international regimes is at great risk. And so I think that a lot of those girls in the university or the faculty, the local faculty that still remain there, they've found a way to cloak it and to hide what they're doing.
Wow. Oh, thanks for your answer. And then maybe you had a question for Ryuko also, I think.
Yeah, I do. Let me come to that in a second, but I just want to I think there's a serendipity here with the university that is important for us, I think. Because of the original, how do I say this? Because of COVID-19. So because of COVID-19, what happened is a lot of that university had to put in place the infrastructure for online learning. And they were doing hybrid in that situation. But the serendipity, the good part of this is that allowed the university to sustain itself post-Taliban, that they already had the infrastructure for online learning. So it's both that pro and con of, wow, this is great that we can still continue this, but the people left in country are still doing this under threat of great risk. So fascinating point there. I did want to say a comment about the three phases and then ask Ryoko a question. The three phases are, I'd say, in kind of an early stage of development, of becoming theoretically robust. I think at the moment it's much more of a intriguing provocation for us to think post-structurally beyond the dualities. And so it challenges us to think beyond those dualities, but it hasn't really been employed at all. I think Metro wrote her paper in 2020, and I'm just now trying to apply it with this empirical data. So I'm interested to see where this goes as well. Now, my question for Ryoko, because I was at your talk yesterday, and you had mentioned in the anti-racism talk about both the anti-racist frameworks and then also decolonial frameworks, so how to bridge between those two. And in our own study here, we used both. We didn't use anti-racism, but we used decolonial and we used other theoretical frameworks as well. So I suppose my question for you from yesterday, this is a lingering question, was how you bring those two together. And the reason I'm asking is because in the excellent presentation of the data from South Korea about anti-racism, the analysis of most of that data was focused from an anti-racist lens, not so much from a decolonial lens. So I was curious how you were thinking about those two together.
So my presentation was like two papers put together. So sorry about that. But so the decolonizing anti-racism was actually proposed by Canadian scholars, Indigenous scholars, because in Canada, because there's a perceived lack of slavery, the racial politics is very different from the United States, right? So the racial politics becomes, white settlers and Indigenous people. But in the meantime, in the 1960s, there was an influx of immigrants from non-European countries, like in the United States. Right. So then there has been a lot of, discussions about multiculturalism. Actually, multicultural policy was developed because of that change in immigration pattern, and also Quebecois, independent movement and all these things. But anyway, there has been a lot of racism against settlers of color, right? So settlers of color got together and they started to mobilize themselves to talk about anti-racism, to take an action of anti-racism and things like that. And then the Indigenous people said, wait a minute, what about us? We have been in this country for so many years and you're now talking about anti-racism. What about, racism against Indigenous people? So that's where, decolonizing anti-racism came in. So this was a criticism about anti-racism by the Indigenous scholars. So that's what I was talking about. But then my study with Yanju Seo about African-American women teachers who are YouTubers, that's kind of separate. So
two different studies. Yeah, I can.
Yeah, so sorry about that confusion.
No, it's very clear. I can see what you're doing, because the issue is, I think of Tuck and Yang's paper that decolonization is not a metaphor. This is the one that comes to mind. And so as many of us use anti-racist or social justice frameworks, whether we can, should, or should not conflate those with and blend them, compare them with decolonial frameworks. And so that's where the question's coming from. And I have it here within my own project, that on the one hand, I'm using frameworks that we might call other, like looking from alternative perspectives, but by Jocelyn, but in the alternative perspectives, not wanting to conflate alternative perspectives with decolonization. So seeing these as separate things.
Yeah, so decolonization has been a kind of buzzword now, right? So a lot of people coming from, South American context and, Santos and other, Mineral and, Walsh and, all these people talking about decolonization and also from Africa, I think in that framework, anti-racism is part of it, so like, all the anti-oppression is part of this, decoloniality, decolonizing mind is about, talking about all the historical legacy of, colonialism, which is attached to racism, and also, gender issues as well. So I think it's like a big package, under the umbrella of decolonization, but at the same time, like, Tak and Yang, we need to really talk about indigeneity and, decolonizing the indigenous, not decolonizing, settler colonialism. So that's a different sort of geopolitical context. So it's a little bit, muddling, and it's a little bit complicated, but yeah. So I guess we need to talk about these things, situationally, like, different geographical contexts of different politics and different discourses. So.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating actually. Because your colleague Andre Elty at UBC with you. So I think one of the really profound contributions she and others have made is the decolonizing of the body and decolonizing of ontology, which is, I think, is this great contribution to, as you were saying, Mignolo and Walsh and others, Santos, that talk about decolonizing the mind. The body is such an important space to do this within. And I suppose I never really thought about it this way until you explained it, but I suppose the settler colonialism of Canada really plays into this sort of narrative and understanding. Yeah.
So the discourse is quite interesting and sometimes very contentious, but it's a difficult, right? Doing anti-racist work is, our university just published recommendations of the President Task Force of Anti-Racism and Inclusive Excellence. I was part of this group and I chaired the faculty committee, but there were 6 committees, including faculty, students, staff, people of color, Black, and Indigenous people. So, like, Black people, people of color, separate from Indigenous people. So that's, how the racial politics is kind of, yeah.
Wow, I'm really glad I stuck around too, and I was here for this your talk, Kevin, and the discussion you're having now. And Ryuka, I'll definitely check out the recording of your talk yesterday. I missed it, but I'm very curious.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering quickly, just curious if either of you have any ideas, or have you read or heard about currently in the US about issues with, how do I explain this? The book Anti-Racist Baby, and pressures to have what is it called? Like removing curricula and removing books under the term is like slipping in my mind.
You talk about the backlash against critical race theory?
Exactly. Critical race theory, yeah, the backlash. And like, so is this right. Just I don't know. Have you heard anything about that, or any ideas about that at the moment? Maybe my final question. Which is it's a very broad question, right?
It's
how much
big
time
in
do you
the
have?
United States, not in Canada. Maybe it's coming, but because of the different racial politics, we don't have that discussion yet. But in the United States, depending on the where you are, different states have really huge backlash, and it's so unfortunate. Critical race theory became a target of attack. It's an easy attack because people don't know about it, right? And people don't say the schools are teaching anti-racism. They don't say that because, if they say that, they're sort of admitting that they are racist, right? So, so it's very interesting, what theory or what term they chose to attack. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard commenters say a lot of people are making it an issue, and they maybe, like you said, we're not even aware if this exists, or if it does, maybe it doesn't, this type of education. It's just like, maybe it's a bit of scapegoating. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But that is, that's kind of a big topic, maybe.
Yeah, I think go ahead.
Sorry, Roko. I was just going to say, because actually in the question at the end of your talk yesterday, very excellent question. One of the challenges I think with doing CRT isn't used a lot in the Korean context, or I would expect in Japan as well, because the social cleavage that we're examining isn't as much racially oriented as it is socioeconomic class. But I think there's a lot of potential to be using CRT here to explore and also to rethink CRT. What are the racial dynamics that we're talking about, and how do they contextualize themselves differently in East Asia than they do in the US? The US, especially, is very racially oriented. Racism, anti-racism are much more dominant themes there than they would be here. So I think there's a lot of potential, interesting space here to explore CRT.
Yeah. I mean, it's like a huge complex notion, but what I actually presented yesterday was about CRT, critical race theory. I didn't call it critical race theory, but the content is actually it is. So if you watch the video,
yeah, great. Then I'll hear more of your thoughts on that. Thank you. Yeah, sorry, I think I need to maybe try to take a quick nap or something before my presentation. I'm like slowing down, but yeah, it's really, really great to join this, and thanks for attending and presenting, Kevin. And I'll stop the recorder now for this.